episode 124 of Silver Lining for Learning, and I'm very excited about this episode on microcredentials. This is an area that I've been tracking for some time. Katie Sievers, one of our guests, is a former student and also has co-taught with me, and she can attest that in the course we spend a substantial amount of time talking about microcredentials and the value that they bring, but also the secondary effects of microcredentials that shape a lot of the landscape, both in higher education and in employment. So we're really happy to have these guests today. I'm going to ask each to introduce themselves. And Katie, I'd like to start with you, where you can explain just what a microcredential is.
Sure. So I am a former student of Chris's, longtime listener, first-time joiner. I am currently a professional services consultant at Credential. And Credential has a digital credentialing platform, which I'm going to show you in a second, because I find that oftentimes it's hard to describe what I do and easier to show. And oftentimes it's because the term digital credential is a little bit nebulous until we see it. And so just as a means of introduction, I'm going to break down kind of three key terms. I define a credential as any record of academic or professional achievement. And if anyone wants to disagree with me, I'm like more than happy to be disagreed with. An alternative credential as a non-degree credential, and a digital credential as a digitally rich, which I'm going to show you really quick. Here is my suite of digital credentials. So a data rich, meaning it has lots of, we call this metadata, and skills based. You can see some tags here specifying specific skills that this particular credential verifies. And of course, verifiable credential, meaning we can see who has earned that credential when and who has validated that achievement. It's validated by a third party. So the digital credential and the platform that Credential, houses these credentials on is meant as a essentially vehicle to transport skills data across different systems. And so when I say digital credential in the future, during this conversation, I'm talking about the vehicle of this technical tool that we can use to carry skills data across different systems. So my job is to work with enterprise organizations to help them create credentialing systems. Typically, this is within internal learning and development contexts, but also with large training providers, product certification providers, and the like. So really a pleasure to be here. Super excited about this conversation. Shall I pass it over to Scott?
Great. Thank you, Katie. And so happy to be here, everybody. My name is Scott Van Pelt. I'm an associate director with the Wharton Communication program at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. Despite what some might think, the communication program is not the communications arm for the school. It's actually a program that manages the communication curriculum for MBAs at Wharton. So teaching persuasive communication and management communication skills as part of the core curriculum. And in addition to that, I'm also, along with Dr. Arthur Levine, President Emeritus of Teachers College up at Columbia, co-author of a book that came out last September, The Great Upheaval, Higher Education's Past, Present, and Uncertain Future. And thinking about the uncertain future of higher education, micro-credentials, digital credentials, alternative credentials, they all really fit into that. And I think it might be helpful to just give a little bit of context into, where this comes from. Micro-credentials, digital credentials, it's easy to just look at these things and think, is this just a tech fad? Is this ed tech gone too far? Are people looking for a solution in search of a problem? But it's really not. It goes beyond that. And we need to look at what's driving demand for these new, I'll call them artifacts. One thing that's important to keep in mind, I think, is that there has really been a long-term dissatisfaction with traditional credentials. So thinking about 2-year degrees, 4-year degrees, professional degrees. And part of that dissatisfaction is the lack of specificity and the lack of data that you get from those artifacts. You think about what the average student gets when they finish a program. They get two artifacts, right? They get a diploma, which doesn't really tell you anything aside from the subject they were studying. And then you get a nice signature from the president of the institution. It's some nice language around the trustees saying, oh, trust us, this person knows what they're doing. They earned this degree. But if I'm an employer, if I'm someone trying to consume this credential and get useful information from it, I'm not getting much of use from that. So what do we have besides that? Well, we have a transcript, okay? College transcript. You're going to have course numbers that don't really make sense to anyone outside the institution. You're going to have course titles that are cut off, and the course titles themselves don't tell you too much about the skills or knowledge that actually are contained within that experience. And then you're going to get a letter grade, usually, for the student that, for all you know, could be an absolute grade, could be a relative grade. And it doesn't really, once again, tell you all that much about what a student knows or can do. So there have been some valiant efforts to reform the existing credentials. Something like the degree qualification profile comes to mind, efforts to bring more information, more specificity into existing credentials. But there are other pressures besides that factor into this. And the pandemic really has only accelerated some of these. In short, the needs of the labor market have changed. They've picked up in speed. They've really accelerated. Two examples that I want to highlight in brief before passing it on. So first, the speed with which information and knowledge becomes outdated. There's a famous quote that has made the rounds over the past few years. It's I'll quote it for y'all here now. Half of what is known today was not known 10 years ago. That's a quote from the American Society of Training and Documentation from 20 years ago. 20 years ago, they were saying that the amount of knowledge in the world was doubling every 18 months. Well, here's the thing. It's gotten a lot faster. It hasn't slowed down. There were researchers at Harvard Medical School. They were considering the field of medicine specifically. And what they found is that the time that it takes the body of knowledge in the field of medicine to double is down. It's way down to just 73 days. So the degree to which knowledge becomes out of date and increases is faster than ever before. And the second thing here is the pressures of automation, which is also on the rise. I'm sure most of us have probably seen the famous McKinsey report that argued that as much as half of time spent on job tasks today could be completely automated in the next 10 to 20 years. So what that means is that we're going to see some skills decrease in need, other skills rise in demand, and the speed with which that happens is going to be very fast. So take all of that, and what I extract from it is really two takeaways. We need new artifacts, we need new credentials, and they need to be specific and they need to be agile. Because people are going to need to reskill and upskill at a much more frequent pace than ever before, and it's going to be throughout their entire lives. The current artifacts that we have just don't cut it. And I'd really be interested in hearing about the experience of someone who has actually undergone this process of pursuing new kinds of credentials. So how about I toss it on over to Brittany to carry us forward?
Thanks, Scott. My name is Brittany Storie, and I am not only a lifelong learner, but I lead the HR practices at Credential, which is the world's leading platform for creating, issuing, and managing digital credentials. Credential is part of the workforce skills division of Pearson, which has a well-known reputation as being a global learning company for several years. I am someone whose career in life has benefited tremendously from microcredentials. In fact, approximately 10 years ago, I was faced with a difficult and all too common situation in that I was a young single mother without having received a formal college degree at that point. I had completed several college courses, was not able to enroll myself back in school full-time to earn a degree, and also knew that I desperately wanted to provide a better life for myself and for my young child. And I knew that I had a lot of that I could learn. And I knew that a lot of that would have to come from on-the-job training, micro-learning opportunities. And I knew that I had the aptitude to be able to do so. And I was also eager to prove the naysayers wrong. So at that time, I could not negotiate a higher salary. In fact, many employers wouldn't even take a second look at me. that's a whole separate conversation. But I was able to negotiate a professional learning development stipend for myself, and I took night classes through Pace University's Lubin School of Business. I worked very hard for 13 weeks, studying every moment that I could between working and caring for a young child, sacrificing a tremendous amount, knowing that it would pay off longer term in my career and in my life. And at the end of those 13 weeks, I sat for a certification that completely changed my life because I passed it. And along with that certification, which proved that I had the skills, the knowledge, and the abilities to do what other HR professionals could do and maybe could not even do at that point. With that certification and a lot of grit and a lot of hard work, I've been able to advance tremendously in my career and provide a life that is completely different and completely unimaginable to the 27-year-old me that was sitting in that desk several years ago.
So I'll jump in to ask a couple questions about this and also begin with an observation. The most recent book that I co-edited, the 60-year curriculum, is about lifelong learning and the fact that people will have multiple careers rather than jobs, and degrees have all the deficiencies that our guest experts have described. But there's also just a problem with grain size, and Brittany, you would do a great job of illustrating this. You know, that to say to somebody, sure, you can have a different career, or you can upskill dramatically within your career. Just give us 4 years, or just give us 1 year and a lot of money, and it's all or nothing. Right? If something happens during the 4 years and you have to put it on hold, you have nothing at all. So the idea that there's kind of a steady stream of accomplishments that are documented and validated, which is true for what learning is. It may not be true for what education is, but it's true for what learning is. And we can now have mechanisms, and Credentialing is an example of how to accomplish that. That's a big deal. It's a big deal for employment. It's a big deal for lifelong learning. And to the extent that it draws people away from degree programs because they see the success of people like you, Brittany, it's a big deal and not a good way for traditional providers. Kurt, let me toss it to you for a question.
Okay, so I have a couple of things. I'll just go into one of them at this point. So what is your vision of micro-credentials and maybe your hopes for it 3 years out, 5 years out, or 10 years out? Have you been thinking about it? And then, so your vision of what it actually might look like, or your vision of, what you hope it would look like, or maybe your worst fears of what might happen. So either comment on reality, comment on utopia, or comment on, hysteria, or the problems that we face in this area of micro-credentialing. Any of those three aspects, I'm curious what you would have to say. Katie, you're going to jump in here?
Sure. I might start on a pessimistic note in the hopes that we can then steer the conversation toward how we can avoid that future. But I think my fear is that alternative credentials continue to be misunderstood in the marketplace, leading to a lack of trust from employers. The reason I think and hope that Brittany has been so satisfied in her career is that her credential that she earned was trusted by her employer and her future employers at the time to show proof that Brittany could succeed in a particular role. And having worked with Brittany, I can say it has absolutely validated that truthfully. And I think, if we see that success and we can see close up what an earner of a credential can do, it's easy to make that judgment call. Like, of course, Brittany is qualified for this role, but there's a lot of trust that has to be packed into that decision, that is not just a technical call of like someone getting that information into the right system. It's not a prestige call solely. It's trust in the outcome being something that is consistent and I think important in the same context, so contextualized. And the smaller the grain size, the harder it is to continue to make that consistent call. And I think, there's been a lot of great research done by Sean Gallagher at Northeastern, for example, on employer perspectives of alternative credentials. And that is just like continually still I think employer perspective is, there's so many, there's like hundreds of thousands of alternative credentials out there. How on earth are we supposed to make sense of all of these in order to make more equitable, better hiring decisions? And so I think, to avoid that continuing to be the case, I think perhaps better infrastructure to support a real transition to skills-based hiring could be really, really important. And by infrastructure, I mean like giving people the right data, and I mean the right like true validation that, the credentials result in certain efficacy metrics and, the full, validation that we expect from any education that needs to kind of transform to be a bit more agile. But also that the right people are seeing that information and that those right people know what to do with it. And that's a people change. And so I think there's a lot of like change management throughout the system and a lot of incentives that need to change that are not just about the, things that people are seeing on the screen. So I'll just start there and hopefully we can.
That's exactly what I was hoping you would chat about and get us started with. And I'm wondering if Brittany or Scott would like to add anything to that.
Yeah, Katie, I completely agree with your fear. I think, there is a lack of trust because right now there's a lack of understanding around what micro-credentials are, how they should be interpreted, how they should be used, especially by employers. And, in a way, it's a bit unfair because we're asking for evidence that we've never really demanded of traditional degrees. I think we make a lot of assumptions around what a bachelor's degree represents without really digging into whether or not that's the case. The struggle, I think, is that people understand degrees. You don't need to explain what a bachelor's degree is. People just kind of assume, oh, okay, yeah, bachelor's degree. I know what that means. I can understand that. I can digest that. But you start talking about micro-credentials, and despite their promise, it's a whole different shift in how we think about credentials. So I agree that is a major challenge. To overcome. There's a bit of consumer education that needs to occur, not just for employers, but for institutions as well, to understand how they can use micro-credentials effectively. These are not just participation trophies. They are artifacts that certify achievement or attainment of knowledge and skill sets that can be demonstrated, that we can provide evidence for. I think my fear, to add another pessimistic note before I add a hopeful one, is the degree of noise that might be created. And here's what I mean by that. It really connects to this idea of standardization, especially as we talk about stacking credentials. Stacking credentials and having alternative credentials, micro-credentials work with one another. That's great if a learner is staying at one education provider. But the reality, and at least the way I see it, is that lifelong learning is really going to increase the degree to which adults pursue credentials and learning from multiple providers over their entire lives. And if those different credentials don't speak to one another, if they can't relate to one another, I worry about that, what that means for learners. And I worry that we just end up with a lot of micro-credentials that don't connect to one another. Now, my hope, to get to a more positive note, is that we do see a transformation occur where we see greater acceptance of micro-credentials, and in particular, micro-credentials interfacing with competency-based approaches to education, so that when learners achieve these micro-credentials, what they have is something really empowering. It's an artifact that demonstrates to them and to any consumers of credentials that, hey, here's what this person knows, here's what they can do, here's evidence of it, here is certification of who verified this. And it becomes a much more robust and rigorous approach to credentialing than the system that we've really relied on for over 100 years now.
Brittany.
Yes, I'd love to add a hope as well, as not only someone who's experienced this myself, but someone who interviews and hires and helps develop many, many, many people throughout my career. Um, we're all sitting in this call from a certain place of privilege, and we have to recognize that. There are so many individuals living within the US and globally who do not have access to an affordable college education. And in fact, there are so many individuals, even depending on life circumstances, who may not yet have been able to complete a high school education program. And when I'm thinking about credentials and micro-credentials in particular, I look at them as an opportunity for bite-sized learning, to take on additional knowledge that is timely and relevant and sometimes is skill-based. Is of course skill-based, but you may have an opportunity to learn on the job. It may be through a traditional education program. There's a variety of different ways to have access to these micro-credentials that will allow individuals to continue to develop the skills they need to contribute in accelerated pathways throughout their career. And we need individuals in all varieties of careers. Not everyone should be in the field of education. There's plenty of roles throughout the economy that are needed for a variety of different backgrounds, and there's opportunities to continue to grow and develop in each of them, and providing an opportunity for those individuals to grow, to show what they've learned, and to have advancement opportunities is something that is greatly needed in society.
Punya, you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, thank you for all that you've talked about. And Brittany, thank you for your sharing your story, because that's really powerful. So I'm going to do a couple of plugs here for stuff that we're doing at ASU, just because I think it's relevant, not because I would just want to make a plug. So one of the things that ASU has done recently is reorganize ourselves under what we call 3 different enterprises. So there is your traditional academic enterprise, which is the degree granting part. You have the knowledge enterprise, which is sort of because we are an R1 university, is the new knowledge and research and intellectual property and all of that. And the third one is what we are calling the learning enterprise, which is exactly along the lines of what you are suggesting. But that is arguing that learning, these are all the non-degree micro-credentials. I mean, honestly, they're still figuring out some of the challenges that all of you spoke of, is something I think the learning enterprise is grappling with, and also grappling with that they're within the standard academic institution where the faculty don't fully understand like what it means, where's my content going, who owns it. There's a whole bunch of sort of political, intellectual ownership issues which are also being talked about. But I think that, but to me, it speaks to that there is an understanding that there is this change that's happening, and that institutions of higher ed who do not respond to this are going to get left behind, just along the reasons that you guys talked about before. The other one, which is this interesting one, which speaks to, Brittany, the point you made about people that we are always learning at work. So for instance, a majority of our students here, at least in our teachers college, but other colleges as well, are working while they are studying. And that work is not recognized as being learning in any shape or form, but actually they are learning some of the most important soft skills of being able to succeed and working in organizations and so on. And so one initiative that we have sort of started here is this around experiential learning, or what we are calling Work Plus, which is adding a layer to, so let's say if you work at Starbucks or McDonald's or whatever, what makes it a learning, I mean, yes, you are learning something, but there is no way of knowing what it is that you've learned. But if you add a layer of reflection to it, then you are self-aware about, oh, I have acquired the following skills. And that's where you can also partner with these organizations to say, are you giving challenging work to our students? Right. And so that they are growing and developing. And I think that to me was like a very, just a wonderful idea for an university to be exploring. But I want to come back to this issue of trust that I think Katie, you and Scott sort of spoke to. And if you think about, when societies get complex, basically bureaucracies develop. And bureaucracies are not necessarily bad things. Bureaucracies are basically ways of doing things by creating these black boxes where you can have this transaction between these black boxes, assuming each unit is doing its job, right? Like, so DMV, I'm assuming it's doing its job. So TSA assumes that DMV has done its job when they look at my driver's license and they say, okay, you can get on this flight, right? I mean, and so in the higher ed setup, the currency of the realm so far has been the Carnegie unit. And what's interesting about the Carnegie unit, that it is a measure of seat time, not a measure of learning. There is, of course, great advantage to that. The advantage is that you can now equate something you did in a community college or in an AP class and say, oh, I can transfer it over. You can also equate your experience in a music program with somebody doing physics, because it's the number of hours that you're measuring. And it seems to me, adding these 2 points, that this idea of black box bureaucracies and having a currency that can float between them. So a Carnegie unit becomes a currency that floats across these institutions. That's what defines the degree programs. You get 30 credits, you get a master's, right? Whatever it may be. And I think that, so I'm wondering about if you can speak a little bit about this challenge of finding a credible currency, right? To which is sort of experience driven or learn, a skill acquired driven, to be allowed to sort of move across these different, because I think if that problem gets solved, I think that there is no stopping this movement that you guys are on. And I think that to me is sort of the biggest stumbling block. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. Anybody can jump in and take it off.
Sure. So one of the amazing things about the Credly network is the amount of partnership that happens through like the infrastructure of our platform. One of those is ACE credit, the American Council of Education. Am I getting that right? They have a credit program where essentially they look at professional development programs that are happening outside of traditional college and university settings, and they vet it and recommend credit hours for particular kind of skills or attributes. And through the digital credential, they can endorse a particular credential for a certain number of credits, which then the registrar at any college or university that is an ACE credit partner can say, all right, we're going to take that for transfer credit and give that individual a shorter route to a degree. I think that's a really, really amazing program to help do some of that translation. But I think even beyond that, because that still is within the confines of traditional higher education at the end of the day, if it's going through the registrar and ending in hopefully a faster earning of a degree, if we can get there through a non-traditional or alternative route with the same amount of trust, like that's really, really promising. And that's the shorter route, the more granular kind of credential that we're hoping is going to grant people high growth, high paying career. And I think there's a lot of really promising work happening through employer partnerships. I'm sure you've all talked at length on other episodes about apprenticeship programs and things of that nature. There's also, I think, tech answers to this. For example, within the kind of community college realm, I know there's an organization called Practera that does experiential learning at scale. And they, again, still within traditional higher education, but they bring in industry, they do a project-based learning experience, and they're gaining really, really valuable life skills over the course of a semester-long program with the scaffolding, all of the coursework around it. There are some other solutions being built that do similar things to scale that really, really rich experience that you're describing of working and learning. So those are just a couple of things that came into mind, but I'd love to hear Scott's thoughts on this.
Yeah, Katie, I love what you're describing around experiential learning, and I just want to say a word on that. Before I do, I want to go back to something Penya was saying around the Carnegie unit and how that's the currency of the realm. For anyone who isn't aware of it, I encourage anybody to read about the historical accident that led to us relying on the Carnegie unit. It was, I won't bore everybody with the long historical context, but in short, it was designed to facilitate faculty pensions. And a few years later, they realized, you know what? We can use this to facilitate a whole bunch of other kinds of academic transactions. And so here we are, well over 100 years later, still relying on a unit to measure learning that was never designed to measure learning in the first place. So interesting historical accident. I encourage everybody to read about it. But going back to this idea of experiential learning and how learning is measured and captured and what we actually care about. I love what we're talking about here in terms of capturing experiential learning, recognizing learning that occurs in the workplace. But the problem with our current ecosystem is that the only thing that we're measuring is completion of courses. There's a whole realm of learning that isn't captured, that isn't recognized. I was speaking just a few weeks ago at a student affairs symposium, and one topic that came up, we weren't talking about micro-credentials, we were talking about competency-based approaches to education, but I think the takeaway is very much the same. The question that came from this group of student affairs professionals was, well, what does this movement mean for the work that we do and for the student experience in student organizations, student government, co-curricular opportunities? What's the interaction there? What struck me and what I think is relevant for this conversation is that you can actually democratize the learning process. Right now, our system measures only completion of courses. But if we start looking at skills with all the ways that skills can be developed and all the ways that knowledge can be attained, you could very well have micro-credentials that, and we actually do, I know there are use cases for this, micro-credentials that certify the kinds of skills and knowledge attainment that comes through involvement in co-curricular activities on campus. You might imagine, for example, a competency and a corresponding micro-credential around leadership that's associated with involvement in student government or some other kind of student organization. So we start to capture a lot more, and we get a much more robust picture of what a given learner can do and what they know if we take a skills-based approach. And I think that really resonates with what you're talking about, experiential learning, recognizing work experience. It's very much all the same thread that we can democratize and be much more inclusive around what we consider to be learning.
So thanks, Scott. About 10 years ago, 11 years ago, I went to an institution which shall be unnamed. So my view was to say, okay, why don't we translate our current master's program into a micro-credential program? That was really the proposal. Before I got started, I was called up by the university registrar's office, financial aid office, other professors to say how you're going to destroy this. They say we can, we enroll students by semester, we give them at least 1 credit. There are all kinds of things. I mean, I was stopped. I couldn't move. So that was a very interesting experience for me, because my view at that moment was to say, since you can give 1 credit, why can't you give 0.1 credit? There's no difference in the registrar system, right? 1 credit, 0.1 credit. Why can't you do that? But that's not really the real reason I want to jump in. The real reason I want to jump in is this, is when you guys were talking about the future of micro-credentialing, because right now, I'm sure Scott and Katie, you're very aware, we have credential inflation. We already have too many students with a master's degree, with a bachelor's degree, with a community college degree, without a job that really puts them into that. So that's really already one thing. Second thing, every company, even like a coffee shop, has little micro-credentials for their own people. When they hire someone, they train them. They don't give them a alternative credential, but they train them in some area. Every company has that. So when we push for this alternative credentialing, I know Brittany, you're a very different example, but not in the majority of them. Maybe wasting their money and time earning an alternative credential to do something. So that's one issue. I just would like to get your insights. Another issue has to do is this. With some kind of education, when we give people a degree, it's not what so much they've learned, but really the entire experience. Like somebody, for example, the difference between a GED and a high school graduates. A GED may have learned the so-called content, the skills, but you lost 2 years of high school hanging out with other people. But that hanging out may never be measured or assessed. So like if you go to a university, hanging out might be more important than actually what the skills and knowledge. So how do you deal with those kind of things? Love to hear whatever you guys have come up with that. Katie, go ahead.
Sure. I don't know that I'll get to all of it, but I'm thinking about something Scott said about really validating skills and thinking about the need for like a common language of skills. And I think this plays into what you were kind of describing, Yang, is like every company does its own siloed training, and they are each its own special snowflake of, we know that we need leadership skills. We know that we only trust our training for our leaders. And so there's this lack of ability to translate across contexts, because I don't think we've gotten to a point where we're all really, really clear about how we're defining a skill and the context in which it's demonstrated. And I think when we think about what does skills-based hiring actually look like, we need to have really clear definitions of skills, context, proficiency levels, all of those things that we need to know in order to just trust that one piece of information about this skill of like leadership or like communication, similarly broad. And so I think like if we can be more articulate about breaking things down into like exactly what we are trying to talk about, and that's where some of the metadata, like expansive outcome statements that really say what that person can do and in what context, like that can be helpful, but only as helpful as someone's actually willing to read it, analyze it, and then make a decision based on that information. So there's a lot of information that has to get packed into that machine readable, really quick decision that gets made to inform like a truly skills-based hiring decision. So I'll plug that in, and I'm sure that Brittany and Scott have more to add.
Yeah, happy to jump in, Katie. And Yang, I'll go back to your point around degree inflation, which we know is well documented. We know it's a trend. I'll go back to my earlier comment that I really do think that we're asking for evidence that we haven't demanded of traditional degrees. There is a rather pessimistic interpretation you could make here that employers are requiring college degrees, not necessarily because they know that represents a certain level of skills, but more so because they're relying on colleges as the first level screening. That's it. It's like, oh, you got into a college and you graduated. Okay, that's a first level screening for us. We know to take you as credible. And that to me seems like a very non-equitable approach to interpreting credentials. The other point that you raised, Yang, that I want to address is, which I think is completely valid, is experiences that are not captured, are not measured. So you mentioned hanging out, for example, and immediately my mind went to, well, what might you get from hanging out? Because there's actually a lot that you get from hanging out with people. You get perhaps communication skills, interpersonal relations, working with people from different backgrounds, perhaps leadership. And all of these things, going back to Katie's point, if you can be sufficiently nuanced and be descriptive in what these discrete skills are, even the soft skills, you can still capture that in some way, and learners can still earn that and demonstrate that. And right now, I don't think that we have a good way of certifying that. And that's part of the promise, I think, that microcredentials might offer.
I'll add to that as well from the hiring perspective, in that one of the biggest challenges for companies and HR professionals in general is to eliminate bias in the hiring process. And while 40% of white Americans do hold a college degree, there are only 26% of Black Americans who do hold them as well. So when you're thinking about hiring for technical roles, for example, one of the products that we've developed at Credential, which is called Talent Match, screens solely on the basis of skills. We have earners who are part of our platform who have earned a micro-credential that may specialize in a coding language that they have earned, whether it was on the job or through a training boot camp or something similar. And we can look at that. We can match the candidate with the job that is specifically focused on those skills, not on where they went to college, not on who they know, not on what they look like, not on likeness and biases that a lot of times hiring managers do take into consideration when making employment decisions, either knowingly or unknowingly, and they can hire specifically based on the skills that are required to do the job. And that's the thing that I think we have to continue to focus on. college education is important. Building relationships is important as well. And there are soft skills that can be looked at in different ways. And I think it's just incredibly important for us to continue to focus on what are the core essentials that we are looking for as we're making employment decisions, and how do we have the best hiring processes to evaluate those skills.
So this is a great conversation, and I'd like to build on some of the themes that are coming out in it and make an analogy, which is providing a reference. Because in this huge proliferation of different kinds of alternative credentials, some more meaningful than others, some of the belief that's involved, the trust that involved, is similar to the trust that's involved in giving a reference. And I don't mean a written reference, I mean the telephone reference. So I'll get a call from someone who says, I want you to provide a reference for X. Maybe they've already seen a letter from me, maybe they haven't, but they know that I've been listed as a reference for X. And they say, let me describe, if they're smart. And I had a great example last week of someone who took half an hour to get my reference for the candidate, because they began by saying, let me tell you about this role, which is not a standard role, and it requires some very specific kinds of skills. And so they sort of walked through in a very nice way, in a very professional way, the things that they felt that this person would need to succeed in this role. And where I could, I said, yes, I know about that, and this person has that. Or where sometimes I would say, I just don't know about that. They did, yes, take a course from me. I did have this other, interaction with them, but I just don't know. I'm not saying they don't. I'm just saying I don't know on the basis of my experience. And so that's, if we can get alternative credentials to the point that it's like a reference, and a reference in the sense that the people who are smart don't call me and say, well, you're Chris Dede, so I know if you say that this person's okay, they're okay. The people who are smart say, well, how do you know? How do you know that this person, can absorb a complex set of information and under considerable time pressure produce some kind of a synthesis of it? So they're not challenging me, but they're asking for a warrant, which is a very reasonable request. But the other point I want to make is that part of what they're asking for is not about knowledge and skills. They're asking about dispositions. And you see this clearly where they'll say something like, there's a lot of difficult people you have to work with in this job. Can this person handle that? Or they'll say, sometimes you accomplish something in the job, and then from on high, all that work is thrown out. How resilient is this person? And sometimes I can answer that question, and sometimes I can't. But it's a more complicated question than saying, yes, this person has this knowledge. I've given it to them and I've seen them use it. Yes, this person has this skill. I've taught them the skill and then I've watched them apply it. Disposition, it's a little more complicated, and I don't know the extent to which you think alternative credentials can get at that. But I'm curious as to your thoughts about this reference analogy and the concept of disposition certification.
I absolutely love this framing. And I also think about, Chris, the course you teach on motivation, and how interwoven dispositions seem to be with other layers of identity. And when I think of like the credentials that I have earned, to me, there's this tapping on my identity that happens when I receive a badge that has my name on it that says that I am a data dashboard specialist. And suddenly I might decide that in situations when I am confronted with data, maybe I'd take a second look at that and say, like, this is something that someone like me can take a stab at. And it becomes like kind of interwoven with my identity in a really like interesting way that I think is so motivating as an earner of a credential. Like maybe my data dashboard specialist badge doesn't validate that I'm like a great data analyst, but it could signal that I have a disposition to put myself in front of data and try. There's that like kind of nugget there. And I think, you know, when I think about what Brittany was mentioning in terms of we need to be working towards more equitable hiring, another layer of that inequity comes when the candidate maybe doesn't even apply because they don't think that they're qualified. And we know that happens more for certain, you know, populations than others. If I have something that has my name on it that says that I have this skill, when I see that skill as a requirement in a job posting, I'm more likely to think, okay, I meet that requirement. And that's something that I think a college degree doesn't do us justice in listing out all of the things that we really can claim when we've completed a college experience. So I think there's like so much behind that idea of dispositions and identity and just like seeing myself as someone who that credentials can play into.
If I can just jump in here, sorry, Scott, I know you have some thoughts, but I love what you said, Katie, and made me think of this fact that now we have, again, coming back to the Carnegie Unit discussion, it's like, you know, undergraduate degrees, 4 years. I mean, who came up with that number? Like, does every profession need exactly 4 years of schooling for you to succeed at your job? I mean, maybe some need more, some need less. Maybe you need to do a little bit, go out in the world, get knocked out a little bit, knocked about a little bit, come back, and then genuinely recognize that this is what you need to learn. You know, so I just think, yeah. So just thank you for that. I just want to drop that in there. This numbers always like throw me. It's like, who came up with this stuff? Scott, you had something to add.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So, you know, Chris, I'm thinking about that comparison you made to references, which something that Katie mentioned as well that I think is really worth reiterating is that when we talk about this vision of micro-credentials and what they might enable, I think there's, you know, really a hope there that it could enable a more equitable environment for earning skills and having those skills recognized, because, you know, references are great, they're helpful. But the problem is they rely on networks, they rely on connections that not everybody has the privilege of having access to. You know, and once you have those networks, they kind of create their own opportunities. And so having those abilities and that knowledge certified in a more objective way, in a more accessible way, that's a really hopeful vision to me. But what you're talking about, Chris, you're talking about a disposition. And what occurred to me is the kind of the relationship between the skills you're describing and the pressures of automation and what impact that's going to have on the desirability of certain skills. There was a great book that was published a few years back by Joseph Aoun called Robot Proof, talking about higher education in the age of artificial intelligence and automation. And, you know, when you look at studies on automation and look, there are whole indexes of which skills are going to be automated more quickly than others, which skills are likely to prove resistant to automation. And when you look at that latter set, it really is those human skills. It's, you know, things that for sure need to be discussed in a more discrete, nuanced way. They need to be broken down. But at a high level, these are buckets such as, you know, interpersonal relations, communications, creativity, initiative, things that a robot can't do. And we don't expect a robot to do anytime soon. So if we can have those conversations around, you know, what are these skills? How do we break them down into something discrete enough that we can articulate it and measure it and provide evidence for it? That to me gets us much closer to that point where we have a more equitable landscape for certifying and recognizing skills and knowledge.
Brittany, have anything to add?
Just that in a career of working with a variety of different individuals and a variety of different backgrounds, disposition, motivation, and things like that are very difficult to measure, regardless of if it's in a micro-credential or in a college education, in a traditional educational pathway. So absolutely, I don't know that we'll ever be able to automate that and be able to screen for that outside of having conversations and going through a typical interview process as well.
Yeah, I think even with micro-credentials, I'm still going to get reference calls, and rightly so. Kurt.
Scott, I'm going to point this question at you, but I'm going to expand it to Brittany and Katie. So give me a second to do so. You wrote a book, The Great Upheaval, and that's bound to cause controversy and debate. Some people don't want to be up in an upheaval. They like the status quo, right? So, you have beautiful coffee shops at UPenn. I've been there, walking down some, and restaurants too. And Katie's got the same thing in Boston, lovely cafes she can go to in the Back Bay area and so forth, and Harvard Square, whatnot. And Brittany, in the Manhattan area is, unbelievable for the food and reflective talking and all that kind of stuff. So, I'm wondering, first off, Scott, if you had anybody come up to you and you've been in those cafes, they said, you're the great upheaval guy. You nailed it. You nailed it. And so I want you to describe what you did nail, what people are resonating with, that they thought this book clarified for them in some way, shape, or form. And the same is true for Katie and Brittany. What if people walked up to you in cafes and said, Credly's changed my life in some way, shape, or form? Now, this is all fictitious scenarios. You might not have had this happen in Boston, in Manhattan, or in Philadelphia cafes, but you have definitely heard it on emails or in telephone calls. So take those emails and telephone calls and assume you got those when you're in the cafes of your respective lovely cities. What have those conversations been like that have come your way? What are the people talking about and complimenting you on and offering us some optimism towards the future? And in the case of Scott, does it have you thinking about writing book number 2? So I'll end there and let you guys comment on that. Scott, you can take it first.
Sure. Kurt, I appreciate your disclaimer that this is a fictitious scenario, because otherwise I was going to tell you, you think I'm much more famous than I am. I don't think anybody's stopped me at a coffee shop yet, but maybe one day. But you're completely right. I've been speaking, especially over the past year and a half, Arthur and I both together and separately, with state systems of higher education. We've spoken to the leaders over in Florida, Maine, Arizona. We've met with individual institutions, especially community colleges and actually healthcare education institutions have been very receptive to this messaging. And I think the aha moment for a lot of folks is that related to something I mentioned right at the start of this discussion. It's very easy to look at the landscape of education, especially higher education, and get overwhelmed and think, where is all of this stuff coming from? I mean, we're talking about new modes of learning with online learning, virtual reality, augmented reality, predictive analytics, and adaptive learning algorithms. And it's so easy to get overwhelmed and look at all of this and say, this is just a fad. It's, higher education has worked just fine. We have adapted just fine for decades and decades. This is no different. The thing is, when you start to break down the macro trends that are occurring outside of higher education, so the fact that we're in a period of great economic change, the great upheaval, really what we're talking about there is the shift from an industrial analog-based economy to a global digital knowledge economy with a completely different emphasis on the resources that we value, on the skills that we value, the speed with which those skills become outdated or new skills emerge. We are in a period of change that is unprecedented in terms of its magnitude, its scope, its size, its pace of change. And, my worry, and what I think a lot of these audiences start to understand, is that you can't just bury your head in the ground. I'll give you an example that I sometimes use in these talks just to help illustrate this point. But, let's say that you are a student thinking about where to go for your next educational experience. And let's say you're interested in something like user experience design. Well, you can sit around and you can, look at what your local institution is doing. You can wait to sign up for that course. Chances are you'll need to wait until the next term to do so. It might be several years before you attain a credential that has any value in the marketplace. So Chris, going back to your point, and And then when you do, you get a credential that doesn't say all that much about what you have learned or what you can do. Well, now here's an alternative. Google is now offering certificates that can be completed within 6 months, cost $50 a month. It's self-paced, so you can do it anytime on your own time. And when you finish this and you earn that credential, Google has partnered with 150 employers across the country, like Deloitte, Accenture, Verizon, major employers with a national footprint. Now imagine you're a student making that decision. What are you going to do? So you start to think about this, and you realize that very quickly, if institutions don't wake up to this new world that we're in, they're going to find that their students just aren't there anymore. And by then, I worry that it'll be too late for a lot of institutions to make any pivot that would be necessary to better meet the needs of tomorrow's learners that many of these non-traditional entrants are already aware of and adapting to.
So we have only 5 minutes left, as usual. Time goes very quickly, and I know that we're not close to a thorough examination, but I do want to ask Katie and Brittany to each take a couple minutes and just talk about, in response to Kurt's question, and more generally, what message would you like to leave people in the audience with, people who might include university folks, who might include prospective consumers of microcredentials, who might include employers? What would you like to tell them?
I'll go then, and if that's all right, Brittany. I've been on a soapbox lately about program evaluation. It sounds boring, but I think it's very important. And I think especially in the world of alternative credentials, where we are, maybe unfairly putting higher pressure on those providers to prove their worth. I think we need to have a better way of saying this is, I guess, who this program works for, at what time, and like for what purpose. Like, how are we actually setting consumers of this education up for success? And I think like having better metrics around what value looks like. It's not just a new job after you get a credential anymore. It's like, maybe I'm putting a certain value metric to my enhanced confidence in my role that keeps me around longer at my current employer or helps me get that promotion. I think we need just better value metrics, better evaluation. We need to like hold ourselves accountable as credential issuers. And I think that, platforms, networks like Credly have a role to play there. And I think we're, stepping up to the challenge. And so that's, I think, what I would like to leave it with, but I'd love to hear what Brittany has to say.
Absolutely. I'm in agreement with you, Katie and Scott. And also just encourage employers, individuals, and educators to keep in mind that the world is changing rapidly around us. And we must continue to embrace a culture of lifelong learning if we want to advance ourselves, advance our companies, and make the world the place that we want to see it to be. So when it comes to what I advise learning and development departments to focus on, and companies in general, eliminate any sort of barrier for access to education, build learning into expectations of the job itself. Depending on the type of environment that you are working in, there is likely always going to be a need to advance skills, to upskill, to reskill, and in some cases unskill as well. So you can do this in a variety of different ways. You can provide learning and development stipends. You can create a culture in which learning does take a priority within the role itself. And if you think about companies that have the highest engagement in the Gallup Q12 survey, one of the areas that is of focus is that people need to know that there's someone at work who encourages their professional development. That's what we're all craving. So I think that this is something that makes sense. And being able to implement this in ways, whether it's bigger, like working towards a degree program or focusing on micro-credentials, we can't stay stagnant. We have to figure out a way to encourage individuals to focus on ways that they can continue to gain skills to advance whatever it is that we are focused on.
And just to build on that, Brittany, I think that a lot of equity efforts are to some extent misguided because the whole focus is on getting people into college. But maybe that's not the right focus in the times that we're living in now. And those equity efforts have the right heart, but maybe not the right head in terms of thinking about what's really going to make a big difference in this area. So I want to thank all three of you. This has been a terrific show, and you're working in a really important area, as our discussion illustrates. And I hope that you will feel empowered by this and keep moving forward with it. Yang, tell us about next week.
All right, thank you. That was a wonderful discussion. We could have it done over a year. It's a very messy environment. So thank you so much for bringing some clarity, and maybe we can do a lot more of this. So next week, I will actually be a guest. It's kind of funny. Next week, we'll be talking about democratizing creative education and side effects in education. And these are really fairly new topics because creativity has become important, but schools don't really deal with them. For example, how can we assess creativity? Can creativity be assessed? Can it be taught? Various issues. Another issue we're dealing with is really side effects. When you do something right, like you take the vaccination, it will have side effects. When some program helps some people, it will hurt others. So this is these are the themes of the two journal issues of review of researching education, RRE, published by AERA. I have been editing this with Professor Ron Beguero of Arizona State University. And so next week, we'll try to discuss these two sensitive issues. Thank you very much. Looking forward to seeing you next week.